No, this is going to be seen by millions, but it might be seen by someone who is interested. So
yeah, I don't need million jobs. I need one job. So
yeah. Okay. Well, if you're going to lack ambition, fine. Pavel, who the hell are you?
Well, I asked
if you want to introduce
that,
yourself.
Yeah, I was gonna say I ask myself that every morning. People ask me, what do you do? And I say I do my best. I sit down in front of the computer every morning, and whatever's happening at work is whatever I got to deal with. And I think that a lot of people in this industry can relate. I've bounced between product management and UX design and UX research and front-end development roles kind of for the last 10 years and a bit. And that's really been the unifying principle is whatever needs to get done, someone's got to do it. And very few people have my combination of background, skills, and experience that you kind of need to see how the pieces fit together. So a lot of the time, either I'm the one who's got to do it or explain to someone else how to do it and kind of align them to that goal, to that user-centered goal, because we've been talking about outcomes over outputs in this industry for so long, and I don't think we've made much progress, to be honest.
No, we haven't. So I have two questions off the bat based off what you just said. The first is, to what do you ascribe that your set of skills is, like the fact that you have those skills is different than what other people?
Well, I think that my education is a big part of it. My undergrad is in kind of more conventional graphic design. We had those lead and wood block print machines in the lab. No one was using them, but we still had them. We had packaging design, editorial design classes, as well as classes obviously on interaction and digital kind of media. And that's really what gripped me in undergrad. I was always better, I think, at that side of things, one of those designers who can code type of people. And one of the things that one of my professors back then said that really stuck with me is whenever people transition to a new medium, they tend to forget all of the lessons that we learned from designing in the previous medium. So in the 90s and early 2000s, people started putting things on the web, and things on the web looked terrible. And a big part of that was not the technology. The technology was okay. I mean, obviously, things are much better now than they used to be, but you could do some pretty decent things in CSS 2.0. But people were thinking about, what are we going to do with this method, with this new medium, and not what are we going to do for our users? What problems are we solving? So it was that perspective that led me to go into my master's studies at Carnegie Mellon for human-computer interaction, which is kind of radically, 180-degree different look at how do we design systems? What is a computer system? What is its role in mediating not only how people interact with machines, but really how people interact with each other. And coming at it from that angle really helped me understand that all of these systems, they're really more the same than they are different. I forget who it was on old design Twitter. Her handle, or her subtitle for her handle, was "Fix the forms one at a time." And in my graduate studies, I really started thinking of the internet as just there's a bunch of forms. It's forms and labels. Twitter is a form. And you put in what you want to post, and you click on it, and then there's a bunch of labels that tell you what other people wrote in their forms. Email is a form. A chatbot is the ultimate form, because you can type in anything, and it's going to give you some kind of output, and sometimes it's helpful, and sometimes it tells you to put glue on your pizza. So really, once you get it down to those fundamentals, you can actually start applying exactly the same principles that you were applying when you were doing conventional design, when you were doing the kind of design that used to win awards and get featured internationally, and back when typographers could be superstars. You can start applying all of those lessons, and you can start incorporating the experiences and the lessons taught by people like Erica Hall, who also have that degree of understanding. So conversational interfaces, her book, explores a paradigm that a lot of people don't really embrace as much as they should. And I think that honestly, it's one of the most important books I've read that has informed my design practice. Because when I'm stuck on a problem with a user journey, I always go back to that. And I think about if there was no interface, if I was just hanging out with my computer and talking to it, how would I ask it for what I want? And how would it tell me how to ask it for what I want? Because like with any person, there's going to be a certain amount of time that you have to take to figure out, how do I tell them what I want? How do I explain to them in a way that makes sense to them? How do I fit my communication to their mental model? And a human mental model is obviously a lot more malleable than a computer's, because a computer's is kind of set in stone unless you crack open the code yourself and you try to reprogram it, or you try to do prompt engineering or whatever. You're really going to have a bad time trying to convince a computer to think like you. If the system is not designed well for your set of assumptions, you have to think more like the system. And the system has to tell you how to do that. The system has to explain what it's doing and why it's doing that. And obviously, the best designed systems meet somewhere in the middle, where you have a set of assumptions that the system clearly articulates, but also the system's designers have clearly understood what assumptions you're going to be coming to the system with, and finding that middle ground where the new concepts that are introduced can be minimized, and bringing over your knowledge and your experience from other applications can be maximized. Even if it's something that's not necessarily standardized, for example, pulling down to refresh as an interaction technique. There's no central library for, here is the way you must do it, that everyone expects to know. And for a long time, the hamburger menu was an example of something that people were doing because they saw other people doing it. It's never been a very good interaction technique. People have been complaining since it came up that, hey, it's the hamburger menu, it's the kebab menu, it's the taco bowl menu, making fun of all those different icons. But it's a pattern that more or less ended up working just because designers brute forced it and people figured it out.
Learnability versus usability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of things on the internet and like a lot of software came at it from that perspective when it really didn't need to. And I think there's something to be said for that. So my background is in B2B and enterprise. I work at AWS now. Before I worked at Bloomberg. Before Bloomberg, I worked at a startup for automation and data management. So none of those are really things where you expect to come in and know what's going on. If anyone's seen a Bloomberg terminal, there's a learning curve. It's a learning curve that takes people years and decades. But once you get it, you really get it. And there's a prevailing attitude of, well, it's enterprise. They will have training. They will have training. They will have documentation. People can go and look up and learn and see how it's supposed to work. And that fails for the same reason that
they won't be given time to do the training or to look up the documentation.
Absolutely.
It's fast.
They won't be given time, and even if they are given time, it's the same thing like when you go in an app you haven't used for a while, and it's like, here's the welcome splash screen. We've updated. We have new features. Do you want to take the tour? There's a button that everyone clicks, and it's that small X in the corner. Because like I'm not going to remember any of this. You're not giving me this prompt at a time when I need it. You're giving me the prompt at a time that's convenient for you, the designer. Because everyone passes through this onboarding, and we can say, hey, look at our metrics. We onboarded 100% of our users. Well, most of them clicked the X button, and the ones that didn't retain anything. So your actual conversion rate for people who learned is much closer to 0 than to 100.
Right. But we met the metric, so
exactly.
It's okay. I mean, it was the wrong metric, but yeah, we met it. Yeah, it's funny how do I want to say this? The prevailing wisdom, maybe that's not right, but I'll just use it anyway to get the thought out. The prevailing wisdom is everybody is going to be using the thing I designed all the time, and therefore maybe we can cut some corners on usability because they're just going to be in there all the time and they'll learn how to use it. And I think obviously there are cases where that's absolutely true, especially if you're making business processing software. I'll just say generically, people have to use that to get their work done every day. And, maybe there are some apps out there that people really hope that users are going to use every day, but the reality is that a lot of those things they probably shouldn't be using every day. And when they don't, like, how are you failing them because you didn't consider that they don't think of you as the center of their universe?
Yeah, I think that's a great example. Also, a great example is like tax software, which you will use once a year.
Right.
And yet, I'm sure that the user stories, that as a user, I want to do X, Y, Z, they're defining that person as the user of their software, when that is, it's like 1/3 of 1% of their year is spent doing this. And that's assuming it takes them a whole day to do that, those taxes. It's more likely going to be less than 1/10 of 1% that they spend with your app. You can't really define them as your user. So,
right.
That's kind of an old argument that I don't really want to get too deep into. Like, do we call them users? Do we not call them users? But I think that whenever you can get specific, you should. The needs of a small business owner when filing taxes are so radically different from my needs that you should say, as a small business owner. And a small business owner is a small business owner, 100% of their time, even though they're a user of your app 1/10,000th of their time. They're probably even thinking about their company when they're sleeping. So It's a much better framing, and it's a much more helpful framing. But it's also more difficult to do that and to think about that full system than it is to focus on your features and your widgets. And so people don't do it because you don't have to. Like you said, it's fast, fast, fast. Ship, and then after 2 years or a year and a half, you leave. And if the numbers are going down, that's someone else's problem and not yours anymore.
Right. Yeah, I've always thought we should write user stories as an intermittent interrupter of a neutral system. I would like to, because these systems just sit around doing whatever they do, waiting for someone to come along and interrupt them. And then hopefully the interruption doesn't last very long.
Yeah.
Keep those systems running very smoothly.
I think that a better framing, and one that I've used before, and I've written about this as well, is you flip the user story. As a user, I don't want to log in. As a user, I don't want to do my taxes. How much can you do for me?
Let's be real. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Like, I think a lot of people will agree with me. I don't really want to use a computer. I want to lie on the beach and I want to sip, the beverage of my choice, and I want to read a nice book and I want to enjoy my life. And I'm forced to use all of these tools and all of these products. Like, no one wants to use a product. No one says, I am looking forward to a full day of Microsoft Excel. They want to pursue the thing that Excel enables them to do. They want to do well at their job. They want to do their, calculations, finish all of their work that's been assigned to them. But they don't really want to do it for the sake of doing it. And I think that embracing that is a much more powerful way of approaching human-centered design. But it's also, once again, much more difficult because it's very difficult to measure actual impact. It's very easy to count the number of features we shipped. And so we're going to put some widgets in, and we're going to put them on the welcome screen, and we'll say that now we have a user base for a widget. But it's just adding more complexity to the user. It's degrading the user experience because now there's this thing in the way of what I'm trying to do. I don't really understand what it's for. I don't understand how it fits my goals. There's a little sparkle icon on it, and it says, try our new AI assistant. And then it keeps popping up, whatever I'm trying to do. And it doesn't fit with the way that I look at my goals. And no one did the work of identifying where does it fit into the way I'm satisfying my goals. There's no observed enduring need that it's actually addressing. And this is something that I tell everyone at work, every customer that I talk to. If you're not observing an existing behavior to satisfy a need, it's not a real need. It's something that you made up so that you can sell your feature.
Yeah, it's a business demand, not a business need, not a customer need, not a whoever need. It's someone said, we need this. And whether that came from, this is what we did at my last job, this is what our competitors are doing, this is what the CEO thought of at dinner last night, so we got to do it. it's, most software probably, and I say this conversationally, 99% cruft. What is the purpose of this? We need to have onboarding that is 11 screens long, because we really need to educate the person who's coming in for the first time about everything that we're capable of offering them. To which I'm like, well, isn't that what your marketing site was for? Isn't that what your social interactions are for? Reminding people what you're capable of. Whether or not they're there for all of those things remains debatable. But it's this constant conversation that I feel like I'm working with people who are in a constant state of terror that no one's going to listen to them. And getting people to calm down first is a real challenge, because they need to calm down and feel, I guess, safe, and before they can really listen to what, and I'll say this very broadly, what the system is telling them. The context of the system within which they're trying to work is telling them. That includes people, that includes the products, physical or digital, the whole thing.
Yeah. There's a piece that I wrote on that a while back, and it really goes back to emphasis of the whole industry on data driven. You have to have data to back up your decisions. With data, you have to measure the impact of your decisions. But to your point, if you're scared of not being listened to, if you're scared of being wrong, you are always going to interpret that data, or even you're going to gather that data in a way that is safest, in a way that reinforces existing assumptions. Nike just lost 32 billion in market cap, or sorry, it was 25 billion. Yeah, 25 billion in market cap, because they were looking at their data through a lens of, let's assume we're doing the right thing. And they've optimized their entire system around that data, and it essentially ended up being self-reinforcing, because they were measuring the thing that was easiest to measure. And they were taking back to the CEO the information that, hey, your initiative is working, all the way up until it wasn't. And they weren't able to see that. And the people who did see it weren't empowered and didn't feel safe to say it's not working. And so, yeah, you get product managers who are making the safe decisions. I think that the majority of dashboards that are out there in the world come from that kind of thinking. Over and over. You can see on Reddit, you can see on Hacker News, all of those social spaces where someone has the opportunity to chime in. People will say, I don't want a dashboard. Studies have been done on dashboards that people don't use them, people don't know how to use them, people don't see value in using them. None of the information is actionable. But we have to have a dashboard because we're data-driven, and we need to report something to our management. These things get created, and people spend all their time scrolling through them, trying to find some data that's actionable. We had a customer, and this is my most recent article, really driving for a dashboard that would show kind of some statuses. And we tried to convince them not to do it, because we did a week of research, literally just like we spoke to 10 people. And everyone said, I will never look here, because I'm assuming that everything is working fine. And if your dashboard is telling me something's wrong, I will not see it. I want you to tell me that something's wrong when you know something is wrong. You have my phone number. You have my email. You can contact me. And you can tell me what I should do. But I also don't want to do anything about it, because you know there's a problem. That means you can fix it. That means that all you need to do is tell me if there's a delay in what I need to happen. But all of that is hard. The dashboard is easy.
Yeah. I mostly hate dashboards. There's a couple times where I think that they are appropriate, but it's mostly for internal people wanting to, and I'll say broadly, wanting to understand the health of their company today, right now. But again, that's what pagers are for, hey, the system's down, you're on call, or, is revenue up today? I'd like to know that as the business owner. But beyond that, it's, let's fill this with graphs and things that people are hey, it looks nice.
Yeah.
Looks nice. I looked at it the time that you showed it to me, and never again.
Exactly. And I think it really comes back to what we were talking about defining your user, the way that you're articulating it. Like as an engineer, I want to be paged when there's an emergency that requires my attention. As a business owner, I want to be able to check in on revenue or on the goals that I measured on so I can see what's happening. But it's all extremely role related. And you need to be very, very explicit on scoping the what needs to exist in the product for each of these people. And that takes a lot of work. But because it's all the same form factor, it's all the same dashboard, in the imaginations of people who haven't thought about the system, it's all one item. And so you get user stories. This is something that I've actually seen in the wild. They said that as the appropriate person, I need to take the appropriate action at the right time when see the appropriate data. And it's like, I mean, yes, it's true, but it's kind of like unfalsifiable. That it's justifying itself, and
it's probably the best and the worst version of a user story. Like, yeah, absolutely, that sounds great. Yeah. Also, what does it tell me?
Exactly. Like it's kind of, I think, a great example of why user story is not the thing. A user story is a receipt of a conversation that you had with your stakeholders and your developers that tells you what needs to be done. And I think it's a good example of a conversation that didn't happen. They just kind of put in something that satisfies everyone. There's another user story that I've seen in the wild that was kind of diametrically opposite. And it goes, as a system, I want to access the database so that I can get the data. And I think that it's...
sold.
Yeah, exactly. Like, sure. Okay. Maybe in 50 years, we've got AI actors that are doing this. We need to write it as a user story. It doesn't make any sense. It's people checking boxes because someone told them it needs to be in this format. We've got to have a user story and we've got to have a dashboard. It's exactly the same thing.
Yeah. I've never, ever found user stories useful for the point in time where I'm involved in a project, which is a little too generic, so I'll be a little bit more specific. I find them very useful for UAT because they're testable assumptions, but I don't consider them design or build information. I think that there are better ways to capture who are the people that we are in service to and what are we trying to do for them. But I've always found them to be, and this is probably more an artifact of how I've literally seen them written, because it's, as a user, I want a submit button on this page, which is not like, why did you write that? The 6 seconds it took you to type that, you could have been coding the submit button. There's a lot of work that goes on in service of what we're outputting into the world that I think is time better spent upfront asking, why are we even doing this in the first place? For who are we doing it? Getting a little edgy philosophical at this point, but it's, I don't know. There's just a lot of activity that I see that gets done that I'm thinking that may not need to get done, or at least not for the purpose you're doing it.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of times we, and I'm just saying broadly because I do it too, I'm sure, aren't really questioning why we're doing the thing, why we're making a dashboard, why we're making a product, why we're trying to help these people versus these people.
I think that is exactly the issue, is people are, to use the words of jobs to be done, which is, I think, another method that has exactly the same issue. People hire user stories to do user stories. And I think that is broadly true of Scrum and Safe and all those things. It exists for its own sake, and impact of adopting it is demonstrated as compliance to it. That we are adopting Agile so we can do Agile.
Right. Yep.
And I think that that's also the same thing with features. I'll always talk about how you can use exactly the same product and design methods to build good process as to build good products. What are you using user stories for? And how will you know if it's successful? That's basically the questions that I always ask is, how will we know if we are wrong in our assumptions, and what are we going to do about it? And so I think that for user stories, the answer is we won't. and nothing. And
Right.
that's the answer to this question in most situations, that we have no way of knowing whether it's the right thing to do. And even if it wasn't, we would have no recourse. We would not be able to do anything about it because it's, the roadmap doesn't have any room for changing our path and redoing the work, or the roadmap doesn't include building our practice. We just do best practices, and then we're following best practices, and best practices means user stories, and so you have to have user stories. And that's the conversation. And I think that people really need to reflect on what is the point of this tool that is not just being agile or following best practices, and where is it working for us and where is it not working for us. And I think that honestly, that nuance, not just binary yes or no, but where, under what conditions is this true, is so critical and so often missed. Because there's lots of conditions where, something is not true, and there's lots of conditions where it is true. Like to give an example, it's easy to sell your home in New York. It's harder to sell your home in coastal Florida after a hurricane. But you can't generalize that to say, well, we did research, we found it was easy to sell your home or it was hard to sell your home, because it all depends on the context.
Context and time, yeah.
I think that's another problem that I often see is because people are not engaging with the context, they're not engaging with consciously making a decision of, okay, we know that this is true in these circumstances. I'm okay with that because I believe these circumstances are prevalent in the field we choose to play in. But because that choice is not being consciously made, it's just like, well, it's true, let's go. Or, well, it's not true, let's not do it. Because really no metric, and I had a post on this recently too about the drill thing, I'm sure you saw it. There's nothing that can tell you or make a decision for you about the space you want to play in. At a certain point in time, you need leadership. You need someone to stand up and say with intention, we are going to do this. I believe this is the right choice. And, people can't do that if they're scared. People will want a framework to tell them what to do, or they'll want a machine to tell them what to do so they can later say, the machine told me to do it.
Yeah. This for a long time, this has been my thing. It's like, I don't know, this is sort of related, not related, but because I saw something recently about, well, let's be real. I saw a headline recently. I didn't read the article about like something like death of the chief innovation officer. My first reaction is like, I'm not surprised, because if the chief innovation officer who sits with the other C-level people, those other C-level people, their main job is to maintain the status quo as best as possible and don't change. Broad brush painting here. And, a lot of times the fear of that, well, what if we change things and things just go south? What if we experiment with this and it goes wrong? This is dipping toes in the water of, hey, let's fail fast, whatever that actually means. And broadly, I just feel like there's this real hesitance because I want to keep my job. I don't want to piss off the boss. The boss wants to keep their job, of really taking a chance and saying, hey, let's stop what we're doing because it's obviously not working. We all know it's not working. And let's work together to do it differently or better or faster so we learn more, or whatever the right thing within their context might be. And I feel like I spend a lot of my energy on that assuaging fear, maybe that is design work too, but doing what we tend to think of as design work. And I'm curious, like you said something at the top about, having experience as product management, with engineering, with design. And I'm curious about because you've whatever, if you chair or hat, you've sat in that chair, you've worn that hat, your view on this stuff, the system of work that we work within, and how that might be seen from the perspective of someone who's, maybe got their start doing design work. What year is it? 2024? Let's say they started in 2016. So they're coming up on a decade of work. They've got a pretty good portfolio. but all they do is design work, and the perspective of someone who has that background versus the perspective of someone who's played in these different spaces directly. There's a question in there, but hopefully
Yeah.
you saw the nugget of it.
Yeah, I think that the approach of just doing design, it's a very tempting instinct to just kind of like go in your design cave and emerge 3 days later, carrying this genius, and everyone's going to clap, and we're going to ship it, and we're going to make $1 billion. And in reality, it faces the same problem as I see in a lot of Agile, where by the time the requirements, and I hate that word, but it's the word that's used, requirements, make it to the developers, Agile has no way of figuring out whether or not they're the right requirements beyond let's ship it and someone else will collect the metrics, and then that someone else will tell us if we got it right. And there's a lot of different frameworks on top of Agile, Lean and Scrum and Safe and whatever. There's a new one every day. All of them bolt the stuff onto it in a weird way that doesn't really work. But the core of Agile, it's really a delivery framework or a concept.
Yeah.
And I think designers kind of fall into that same trap that someone comes to them and says, this is the right widget to build. And I think that as the seniority of this designer improves, they will get bigger and bigger widgets. They look at from a small thing on a page to a section of our app to the whole ecosystem. But it's always going to be waiting for someone to come and tell them this is the user need. And a lot of the time, those people did not do the legwork. They did not have those conversations. They didn't even necessarily see it as their job to do it. And so they're giving you something. They're giving that designer something that is not validated, something that is not really thought through. And it's really part of the job to take ownership of that, I think. If you're hoping to be moving on into a senior role and be effective in that role, you need to understand the stakeholder as another type of user, an internal type of user. Because if you think about it, the majority of our artifacts, they're not screens. They're various models of the system. And you see a wireframe or a mock-up or a sketch, all as models of a system. It's not a product. It doesn't work. Even a prototype doesn't work. It's something that we show to people internally to kind of gain alignment for our decisions and to make sure they understand our decisions. And then developers will build it, and the developer's output is going to go to the user. So when it comes to who sees our work, like actually who puts their physical eyeballs on the artifacts that we created, it's all internal people. It's almost all internal people. Outside of user research that you're doing directly with a customer, using your prototypes, it's going to be someone most likely with the word manager at the end of their title. And you need to understand how these people tick, what they care about, and what they're trying to tell you. I think it's a very common view, UX, that no one else cares about the user. Only we care about the user. We own that relationship. It's our responsibility to be a champion of the user. And as someone who's been a product manager and as someone who's familiar with developers, I can tell you that's nonsense. There's no one who goes into that office at the start of the day or, logs in if they're remote and says, I'm going to do a bad job. I'm not going to make a good user experience. I'm going to intentionally make it crap so that I can get my bonus. No one thinks like that. Everyone wants to create a good user experience in whatever way they understand it. And creating alignment on what that understanding is the biggest part of the job, I would say, for those higher levels of seniority. Because what do people do when they have an idea that they think is going to improve the user experience, is going to make the product better? They're going to go and tell you, hey, build this for me. And like you said, it's some executive had an idea, over the weekend, and we're going to go and build it. And some of those things that they think, like, oh, this is my idea, this is the thing that's going to be good. Some of what they tell you is not what they think. It's what they think you need from them. And there's going to be a certain amount of definition where they're making assumptions because they think it's helpful. They think it's providing helpful context. They think it's providing helpful details. And if you take all of their words as requirements, then you're going to make something that sucks. You're going to make something that doesn't work well. And they're going to be upset too. And they're going to say, the designer didn't do a good job implementing my vision. Therefore, it's the designer's fault. It's not the vision's fault. No, it's most likely the vision's fault. It's most likely that they didn't think it through. But if you're going to get blamed anyway, you might as well do the work. You might as well check and say, listen, we didn't spend a month building this. We spent 2 days talking to people. We figured out that our assumptions are incorrect, and those were the foundational assumptions of this idea. Or you can even go back to them after talking to one subject matter expert that they're probably not connected to. There's a really good framework I've used for this before called PACT, P-A-C-T. It stands for People, Activities, Contexts, and Technologies. It's almost entirely unknown outside of HCI, but it's so useful because you track down one subject matter expert. It's like a business analyst or something in your company, and you talk to them for an hour, and you get this download of all the critical information. And you go back to your executive and you tell them, like, this is why this is not going to work this way. Like, we made these assumptions. It was the thing we believed at the time. But look, we didn't have to build anything to find out those assumptions were wrong. And these are the implications. And you're putting the decision back to them. And you're letting them save face and say, oh, it was a suggestion. You know, it was just like, I thought, knowing what we knew back then, this was the right thing to do. Now we know it's not the right thing to do. Or they can say, no, this is what I want. It's a requirement. And then you can kind of figure out what you can do about it. But I think until you've created that clarity and that alignment, you're going to struggle. The trickiest part comes when you have the three-legged stool, and there's a design org, and there's a product org, and there's an engineering org. And a cross-functional partner kind of nominates themselves executive and starts acting in this way, where they come to you with requirements, and they come to you with ideas, and you have to figure out which is which. And that's really where you need to get your EQ going, I think, because in a lot of orgs, the person making design decisions is someone with the title of manager or director.
Right.
Really.
Yeah.
You are influencing them, and you're rendering their idea into detail, but that's what you're doing. You need to advocate upwards to your manager and their manager so that they can advocate for your vision laterally. And it's not a good way of working. It's a very dysfunctional way of working. But in a siloed org, that's what you have to do. The only person who can influence your cross-functional stakeholder is their manager. And the only person who can influence that person is their peer. So you can't go directly to them, but you need to create that kind of very broad alignment. And that's hard. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of meetings. It's a lot of what product managers should be doing. And they're not always doing it. And so I think my advice to that, 7-8 years in designer who's trying to take their practice to the next level is you need to be good at creating alignment. And alignment is more important than being right most of the time. I would say the 80-20 rule applies here. 80% of the time, I'd say it's more important to be aligned than right, because you ship something that you're aligned on. Oh, it was the wrong thing to do. Well, no one's to blame. As long as we are able to recognize we were wrong, no one's to blame. It's really hard to recognize that we were wrong if someone is to blame, because that person's going to be very opposed to it. But if we've created this kind of shared understanding, then as long as we have clear eyes about whether or not it's true, it's fine. And, there are those cases where it's important to fight for something because the risk is very high, or the chance of success is very low, or it's something unethical. But the way that design builds political capital and the way that design converts people to its way of thinking is not by acting like we are divinely mandated to make the decisions. It's by getting the people who make decisions to agree, ideally with you, but just to agree with each other will already get you most of the way there. Because otherwise, you might be right, but that product's not going to get shipped. Nothing is going to make it into production if there's no alignment. And then everyone loses, and you most of all, because you get pointed out as here's this person causing problems.
Yeah, especially since you're the one who's responsible for what everyone, and I mean everyone, thinks of as the product, the interface. Customers think of the interface as the product.
Yep.
Business people think of the interface as the product. And who makes the interface? I know that engineers make it, but it's like you were saying before, as a designer, your output tends not to be the final system, but a two-dimensional model of aspects of it at certain points in the flow. And that's what people have been aligning around. And when your thing is wrong, it's easy for designers to get, in trouble for that.
Yeah, it's quite a conundrum because ultimately the business model is the product. The product that Uber sells is not the app. It's the cars.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Everyone thinks of it. This is the product. Like Uber is a technology company. It's not. It's transportation. But they make this app, and everyone thinks about the app. And that's contrasted to the way that a lot of product managers, even very high-profile product people, think of these different roles. Kagan has a lot of very good writing and a lot of, I think, really bad writing, because when he talks about design, he talks about usability. And usability is a very, very small circle instead of a bigger circle called usefulness. And designers are responsible for usefulness. Yeah. Effectively, they are, because, like you say, people think of the interface as the product. If the interface is not helping them do useful things, they will think this is a bad product. But if all designers control is usability, and they get to make decisions over what are the capabilities of the system, how does the system interact with other systems, you're stuck in a really bad situation. And I've been in that situation. At Bloomberg, for example, the backend has a lot of constraints, just due to the fact that these are legacy systems from the 80s and 90s in a lot of cases. And a lot of the things that I was responsible for as a PM, but a PM for, the customer experience, relied on those systems doing something they couldn't do. And we had to do so many workarounds to fix on the UI layer in HTML something that was broken many, many layers below it in this kind of like back-end code. The success rate of that approach it's in the single digits. It's not 100%. It's not 10%. It's maybe like 0 or close to it. That you will always create more problems with trying to do that than you're actually solving. And you're creating UX debt. You're creating technical debt. Everyone's upset. And as kind of the person left holding the bag at the end of it, it's like the goalie problem. Whose fault is it that they scored? It's the goalie's fault. Because by the time the ball gets to the goalie, the entire team let it through. But it's just most obvious who tried to touch it last. So I think that's why we cannot ever make a significant impact in our design cave. We need to get out there. We need to talk to people. And we ultimately need to work backwards from the experience we want the customer to have. Start with the goal, and then figure out what are they doing today to get to the goal, and then where in that process is it broken? Because we talk a lot about you got to think big, you got to make this transformational thing, but it's really hard to, first of all, build an end-to-end journey, and second of all, to sell an end-to-end journey to the customer. It's much easier, and it's much more in keeping with the MVP approach to find the one gap and bridge that gap, and then slowly you can expand from there. But just fix something that's broken instead of spending 90% of your time fixing something that's adjacent to what's broken.
Right. Yeah. And then I will take it even further and say maybe your company can just be good at fixing the one broken thing. Because I think it's the death of maybe not the business, but the professions is we have to keep adding things because that's what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Like if you do a really good job of addressing that failure point with whatever you've provided to your customers, and then you're like, okay, well, let's start branching out from there. There's just no end to that. And I don't know, maybe it's okay to just do the one thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a
I know that's an
conversation.
overly simplistic view of it, but
Yeah, it's a
it's
conversation about just the expectations of infinite growth and things like that. If you really think about it, all of our tech giants today, they started by having solved one problem really, really well. And
Mhm.
if you think about what they've delivered since then, they've maybe solved like one or two more problems really, really well. And everything
Yeah.
else is kind of just there.
So one, I'm asking everybody 7 ± 2 questions, just because it makes me laugh to say 7 ± 2. You can answer, not answer, totally fine. What is one thing you would change about your profession?
I think the first thing I have to figure out is what profession that is. As someone who identifies as a designer but has done other roles, I don't know if I necessarily would want that clarity. A lot of people see that as constraining. I think the flexibility of doing what needs to be done is almost, I would say, necessary. The one thing that I would want to change about the way people approach it is, I think, the hostile, siloed attitude of, this is mine, I own this.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we do that. I think that it's a slow process of creating alignment, of creating a sense of teamwork, rather than, well, we have three different disciplines and product is solving product problems, engineers are solving tech problems, designers are solving visual problems, and we haggle over who gets to solve their problems. And in the meantime, the customer's problems go unsolved. I think that taking an approach of we are one team with one goal, and not just as a platitude, but actually making it real and having everyone measured on that one goal is the way forward. I think that more than any kind of agile framework, that is the way that we're going to fix it. But I think ultimately just that attitude of we are one team that does all of these things. We are not three different functions trying
Mm-hmm.
to slice up the pie necessary as a transformation if we're going to move forward as a practice.
Yeah. The best experiences I've had have been on teams that think that way. We move faster and we get the right things done more often. Not saying it's perfect, but we're more right than just producing stuff. So yeah, great answer. What's one thing you wish people cared more about? And no constraints on this. Could be anything.
I think in a broad sense, sustainability. And part of that has to do with, we just talked about the desire for infinite growth and adding more crap. And it doesn't really help anyone. Obviously, in the context of the web as a whole, so many things that were created over the past 30 years, you can no longer access them. And it's not just things that were created 30 years ago. Flash died and all those things are gone. A lot of
Yeah.
websites, broken links, never redirected, never fixed. Just things like that, like hardware systems. I know there's a big, for example, preservation effort for video games and for different formats like HD DVD and things like that, because everything on those discs and those cartridges is going to be very difficult to actually obtain and engage with very, very soon if it hasn't already. You've got cartridges going for thousands of dollars on eBay, and it's like, this is the last copy of this special version of Pokemon Yellow with like a Pikachu that has a hat or whatever, and all of that gets lost. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that also, especially in the context of environmental sustainability, like we're building more and more data centers, we're building more and more other kinds of infrastructure, using more and more power for things that no one really asked for, and for things that are not actually improving our happiness, our productivity, our health outcomes, things like that. And all of that is really going to catch up to us. And for a lot of products, it's already caught up with them, where there's so much stuff that your existing users are unhappy. Your new users can't figure out what's going on because there's too much stuff, and your business kind of falls apart or grinds to a halt. In the same vein, I think that people burn out doing all of this, keeping up with all these different demands,
Mm-hmm.
and focusing on business models and focusing on teams that are sustainable, and not just we're going to run sprints back to back to back to back with no rest period until you burn out and quit, and then we hire someone else. Like, instead of doing that, if we built our teams in a more resilient way where, yeah, we have some slack, and that means that when the problem comes along, we can absorb it because we have the resiliency, we have the slack to deal with it,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just trying to offload that onto, well, you're working 110%, now you can work 120. You know, as soon as you do that, it becomes the new normal. And it's like a ratchet. It just goes up and up and up and up until it snaps, without any counterforce to normalize it. And so I think that's really something that I would want more people to think about in their practices. Fortunately, it's very difficult to do that. The more senior you go, and the more you have pressure from senior stakeholders and ultimately shareholders to maximize quarterly profits. And in the pursuit of those quarterly profits, if you've destroyed 10 years worth of value in the long run, they don't care because they're going to sell their stock at its peak and go do something else. And you have that option as well. I think that we need to find a better way if we want to build better software, ultimately.
What accomplishment are you most proud of that you weren't paid to do?
I think that has a similar problem to the first question, where figuring out where my job ends and where kind of like my choices to get involved with things that aren't, strictly speaking, my problem begin.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm going to go really, really meta,
please do.
All the way back in probably over 10 years ago now, we spent several years building a fence around the cottage. And I don't know why my family decided to not just like buy a fence and get it installed, but we drove down to like the wood mill, and we got boards, and we drove the boards back, and we sawed them into shape ourselves, and we planted them in the soil, and we fill it up with concrete, and this is like a super old school thing, but we got motor oil to waterproof them with. You just paint the motor oil on like paint because it's cheaper, and that's terrible for the environment. But this was like almost, I think, 20 years ago at this point, and it took us, I think, 2 whole summers, like among other things, to finish that fence. It was so much effort, and at the end, it's just like that. I made it myself, and it's kind of a bit sketch. It's still there 20 years later. It's more sustainable than all the software I've worked on, which at this point has been redesigned and redeveloped and retired and replaced with something else. So yeah, I think that something like that I think I can be proud of it.
No wrong answers for any of this stuff, especially the next one, which is probably the most important question I'm going to ask you today. No salsa, mild salsa, or spicy salsa?
So I used to be no salsa person because I used to think the flavor should be in the thing. The thing you're eating should be flavorful. If you have to put a sauce on it, it means you've done a bad job. I have since changed my opinion. I think that a good sauce is an accomplishment in its own right. I think that it's an equal partner to the dish. Most bottled sauces do not rise to the level of a good sauce. Most jarred salsas do not rise to the level of a good sauce. But when it's good, I want it spicy because it's made for flavor. When it's mild, it's like, well, you're defining yourself by the fact that you're mild. Like, I don't want to be mild. I want to be bold, and I want to have an opinion. And the spicy salsa has the opinion. Sometimes the opinion is wrong. Sometimes it's all spice and no flavor. But if you're playing in the mild zone, you don't even have the opportunity to express your opinion. You're just kind of there.
Yeah. I have a cooking background before I got into this line of work. And sauce is basically food is basically a sauce transportation device, unless you're talking about some of the highest quality core food, having a fresh off the vine tomato on its own, or having Wagyu beef or something like that. You want it with nothing on it sometimes. So, all right. So next one is, what's your favorite place on Earth?
It's a great question because, obviously you can frame place as a very broad or very narrow kind of thing. If I'm going to go medium-sized, I would say Taipei is my favorite city on Earth for sure. It's kind of like the best parts about New York, but without, the worst parts about New York. The energy, the food, the subway is a lot better than New York.
Mm-hmm.
The hiking, very accessible, very easy to get to. You've kind of got those elements of Japanese urbanism where there's no on-street parking, cars have their own space. It's very bikeable. It's very much about that like micro transport, and it's just it's a really really fun place to be. That is kind of informed by the fact that I've only gone there on vacation. I haven't like lived there, so I associate it with just having a good time. I think if I was visiting New York instead of living here, I'd also be like, oh, New York, it's so great, but it has its ups and downs. So I think that like medium scope, that's my answer. Smaller scope, I like my couch. My couch is great. I can read a book on it. It's no one's going to bother me while I'm there. And then a similar vein going slightly bigger, I really like the Brooklyn Botanical Garden. It's so close to where I live, but it almost feels like you're transported to a completely different place. You can still kind of hear the helicopters and the police sirens and things like that, but it feels like you're apart from all of that, and just ducking into it for like an hour, it's, especially at the end of the workday, such a fantastic experience. So kind of laddering up from my living room out into the other side of the planet, that's kind of my ranking.
All right. So relative to what first comes to mind when I say this, what do you wish you'd done differently?
I think about that sometimes, and I think it's a very difficult question to answer, because would I have gotten to where I am and thinking the way that I do if I had done anything differently? I think it's easy to say, oh, if only I had not done this one thing, but then everything else happens exactly the same, then like it'd be better or it'd be worse. I think the easy answer, kind of keeping that in mind, is I would have moved on from several jobs much earlier than I ended up doing. I think that there is a kind of complacency mixed together with inertia that you kind of get in a lot of places where you think, oh, I'm gonna show up here, I'm gonna do really good work, and you need to trust your gut when your gut tells you this is not the place where you're gonna do that good work. And you need to trust your gut when it tells you you've learned all you can here. I think it can be hard to do that, obviously, if the market is lousy more often than not. But I think that you need to kind of look at your job as something that gives back to your career and not just something that you go to every day to get money. So, yeah, it's a lot of work to look for a new job. But I think that once it's tapped out, it's time to move on. You need to be decisive. And, the more frequently you do it, the better you get at interviewing. There are obviously people whose main skill is interviewing and they do quite well for themselves. If you're a person who is really good at your job and you're scared of interviewing because you're not very good at interviewing, I think that practice makes perfect, and you're going to be able to achieve a lot more quickly in those roles. And once you've kind of gotten that, you can move on faster. So I think that's really what the advice I'd give myself 10 years ago is, when you join somewhere, set a goal, do the work that helps you meet that goal, and once you've met the goal, you can now figure out what's next. And it could be the next step is at the same company, and it could be the next step is somewhere else. It could be the next step is not a work thing at all. For example, I really only started writing long form almost 2 years ago. I really only started doing a lot of social media stuff about 6 years ago, because I decided that was the right next step to kind of to do for me what I needed for my career to move on, and for my expertise to move on to that next level. And I think that applying that same attitude to the job from day one, not from like, oh, it's 2 years, 3 years, 4 years in,
Right.
You're tired, you're burnt out, and you're starting. That's too late. You need to start thinking about the next step when you take the first step.
Yeah, one of the things I say to people is day 2 of your new job is day 1 of your next job search, because there's always something that's going to be better for you out there. And recognizing, of course, that it is a job to find a job, but at least being open to what changes might come your way is really what it comes down to.
Yeah, I think that there's it's not a 100% successful heuristic, for example, because a couple of weeks after I started at Amazon, this would have been like over 4 years ago, a recruiter reached out. It's like, hey, do you want to apply for this role as a design manager at Twitter. And I was like, oh, I love to tweet. No, it's great, but it's not the right timing. And then shortly thereafter, the acquisition happened and it became a very different company. So in a way, that was a bullet dodged. But of course, at the time, no one could have predicted that. So
Sure. Yeah.
be open to opportunities, but think them through, I guess, is the lesson here.
So next one is, what would you do for a living if you left what you were doing now?
So I think about that sometimes. I think that there's a certain amount of passive income that would just let me do not this. I'm not one of those people who lives to work. I think that if all my needs were taken care of and I can just live safely and do my thing. I think running like one of those combination cafes and cocktail bars or wine bars would be really fun. Do like a renovation on a little cottage in some small town, flip the sign once a day, switch from coffee and baking over to serving wine and cheese boards. I think that'd be really fun. I bake sourdough at home like everyone else who was quarantining in 2020. I do a pretty good martini, so I think that I'd be good at it. I think it'd be fun. And aside from the whole, I don't know if you've watched The Bear, people say it's a pretty accurate representation of how it is in food service. I think that if you have a cheese plate as your most sophisticated dish, you're probably going to avoid most of that. Like, I don't want my job to be stressful. I want to kind of relax and have fun.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's, without thinking too hard about it, that's my answer. Just do a little bar or something.
I don't recommend thinking too hard about anything. All right, so imagine it's a year from now. What do you hope to not be carrying around with you anymore?
Physically or emotionally?
I word these questions very specifically to be as open to your interpretation as possible.
I mean, I travel pretty light, so that's not carrying around with me. I mean, one thing that has changed for me very recently is I got my green card after years and years of sitting on different visas. And so I think that was something I was carrying around with me that I'm glad to be rid of now, is like the pressure of, I need to renew my visa. And yeah, it's 2 years away, but everything takes a really long time. So it's kind of like, oh, I need to do this, I need to do that. I also recently bought my apartment. So that was another thing. Like, as a renter, you're always on that very short horizon of, I need to worry about this. It's happening soon. I need to move soon, renew my lease soon. I hate moving so much. So those were things that I've already gotten rid of. I think in years' time, I kind of want to, not have to deal with my desktop computer anymore. I built it in 2014, so 10 years ago. It's not very good now. It takes up a lot of space, and I think if we're extending the metaphor of carrying things around perhaps a little bit further than you intended, I don't want it to take up space. I think in general, getting rid of stuff, like there's this natural instinct to accumulate stuff, and I think that turning that around and be like, I don't want to carry this with me. I don't want to have all these things. I think, just like that, I want to shrink my footprint. I want to have a smaller computer that still does all the things I need it to do. As an example, yeah, I guess that's my answer.
Yeah. My relationship to stuff changed when I had to clean out my parents' house after they died. And I was like, yeah, we don't need, gas receipts from the 70s. Come on. But yeah, it's just things that have purpose, and maybe it's okay to let go of things that don't. Yeah, no wrong answer to any of these questions. It's more what comes to mind. It's stuff that I think about for myself a lot. So I want to talk to other people about it too and see what their perspective is. And hopefully you can answer the question for me so I can know what to do.
I think it's a lot easier to answer questions for other people than it is to answer them for yourself.
For sure. Yeah. Well, that's it. Thanks for chatting with me. It's been a while since we've talked via video.
Thanks for having me on the show. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I am looking for my next step after my work as a design lead at Amazon. I've been here for almost 5 years. I'm looking to take that next step. So if folks out there are listening and you kind of don't think I'm too crazy, or you want a little bit of crazy in your practice, hit me up.